Hello and welcome everybody to Day 2 of Public Art Matters. So this is the seminar component of the 3-day Public Art Masterclass, which also includes a dedicated artist workshop happening during the day on public art. The artist workshop is looking at inspiration, ideation to implementation, and all the practical tools in between. My name is Dr. Chetana Andary, and I'm a senior consultant at UAP. I'd like to welcome you here and thank you for coming, and just say how incredibly privileged we feel to be back in your beautiful country. So thank you very much for the invitation. Tonight's subject is an exciting foray into the power of art and culture to rethink the dominant global mindset. The format will start with a keynote presentation by Mr. Paul Owens, co-founder and director of BOP Consulting, and he's based in London. After Paul has spoken, we'll be joined by our esteemed panel members. First, I'm going to ask Ms. Dina Amin, CEO of the Visual Arts Commission, to come up and give us a brief introduction to the art and culture development of the Commission. And she'll be followed by Ms. Ilaria Bonacossa, who is the Arts and Cultural Liaison for the Royal Commission for Riyadh Art. And she'll talk a bit about an actual project that is happening in this city. They'll come and join us on the stage, on the podium, and we'll hope that you'll enjoy talking with us and embark on a dynamic and lively conversation. And questions from yourself, please. So first, I'd like to introduce Paul Owens, a leading international advisor and practitioner in cultural policy. He specialises in the creative economy. With his fellow directors, he has pioneered well-established methods to measure the impact of culture and the creative industries. Paul is a dedicated advocate of the role culture can play in a sustainable urban development. And for this reason, he co-founded the World Cities Cultural Forum in 2012 to share best practice. He works with the Mayor of London's team, and he has grown and managed a network of more than 40 major cities around the world and an independent soft power city network worldwide. Tonight, please welcome Paul to present to you Reimagining the City through Arts and Culture. And he poses the question, are we on the verge of a new creative age? Please welcome Paul.
Thank you very much, Chetana, for that nice introduction. And I just want to say what a great pleasure it is to be here in Riyadh. Special thanks to our hosts, Diriyah Biennale Foundation. Thank you for inviting me. And also great thanks to my colleagues at UAP. It's been great fun over the last few days watching you guys in operation. So what I'm going to talk about this evening is sort of where culture sits in the broader thinking about cities and the future of cities. And I've got 3 sort of big changes, big trends that I think are happening that I want to share with you all in the hope that we can have a discussion. And I think that they all have a certain relevance to what you're trying to do here in the Kingdom and in Riyadh and other cities. The first thing I'm going to talk about is the way that the public platforms for culture and the sort of cultural ecosystem in cities is opening up and spreading out. It's a very, very powerful, distinct and rapid trend that's happening. The second thing I want to talk about is how the digital side of our existence is potentially going to change cities hugely and change the cultural offer in cities and the cultural potential of cities. And then thirdly, I want to talk about how basically cities are on a mission to save the planet, and they can't do it without artists, and they can't do it without a cultural ecosystem. So those are my main sort of three themes. But before I get going, I just want to sort of share this this list of cities with you. Right, top 10 cities. That's actually top 10 by population, and you can see 1950 to 2020. That's 71 years. That's a long time, and also a lot. You know, imagine how much the world has changed since then. But I just wanted to sort of quickly just put a question out there to you in the audience, my beautiful audience for the evening. What do you notice about the right-hand column? There we go. Complete absence of Europe and the United States of America. Just keep that in mind as we go through my presentation, and I'm going to come back at the end of my presentation. This is my ploy to make sure you all stay. Yeah. I'm going to come back at the end of my presentation with a map of the world that kind of relates to that and resonates with that, and I'm going to sort of leave you then with my kind of final message, which is a message of kind of great optimism. Actually, I think very interesting for you as an audience here in Riyadh. So. In yesterday's talk, Chetana talked about public art, and she started off with this really interesting statement. She said that, when you put the word public in front of art, you totally change the meaning of the word art. Yeah. Now I'm going to talk about culture, and it's actually pointless to put the word public in front of the word culture because culture is public. So if you put the word public in front of it, you're just repeating yourself or reinforcing it. And just to be clear, I'm using the word culture in a very broad sense. So I'm talking about, obviously, aesthetic forms, art forms, visual arts, audiovisual, plastic arts, literary arts, which are in a constant state of evolution. But I'm also talking about two other wraparounds with culture. I'm talking about culture as customs and tradition and way of life. That's one wraparound. And then I'm also talking about culture as a sort of pool, collective pool of capability that individuals can draw on, communities can draw on, whole cities can draw on as they seek to kind of redefine themselves. And when I talk this evening, I'm going to be drawing on my experiences of working with the World Cities Culture Forum. And the World Cities Culture Forum was founded by the Mayor of London. I've been responsible for coordinating it. And what we've done is we've sort of brought together over the course of 10 years 40 cities to talk about culture as a driving force for city development, for sustainable city development. Sometimes I describe us as the World Economic Forum for Culture and Cities, but nicer. That fits. And obviously, if you look at the list of members there are certain parts of the world where we're much less well represented. So when I draw my lessons from this network, I hope I'm not making too many assumptions, but I think there are still some quite interesting best practices and benchmarks that we can draw on. I think it's important to understand our sort of core product, and it's this thing called the World Cities Culture Report. Who here has read the World Cities Culture Report? Oh, only one person. It's too late. That's 2018. It's well out of date. So look out for the 2021 version coming out in October, and that's going to be all about the future of cities. But the reason we started to do this was because we were basically looking at how big cities, or in fact cities generally, compare themselves around the world. And there are basically over 100 different city indices around the world. And very often they'll make a reference to culture. I mean, whether they're talking about power or soft power, they'll make a reference to culture. Often when they're talking about quality of life, they'll make a reference to culture. And when we looked into it, we'd always find that they would just use 2 or 3 indicators. So what we did for this is we built up an indicator set of 60 indicators for culture in cities. And the purpose of this is to sort of put them next to each other and think about it. And there's basically 2 sets of indicators. There's a set of indicators about the cultural production that happens in the city. And we've coined this term cultural infrastructure because we want our policymakers to think of culture as infrastructure, as important as transportation, environment, all that kind of thing. But we also look at how culture is consumed in the cities. And I should tell you that it's a sort of kind of, even with 60 indicators, it's still not really an adequate reflection. So one of the things we don't do, and I'm going to talk about this in a minute, is we don't really capture the way cultural consumption and, if you like, cultural platforms are developing in the digital space in cities, and I think that's a hugely important factor for the future. I don't want to talk about this now, but this is a little bit of a sales pitch. we've decided that we're going to do another project, which is called the BOP Culture 500, where we're going to pull together a database of 500 cities around the world, drawing on big data sources. And all the time, what we're trying to do is we're trying to make the argument that culture should be at the heart of thinking about cities, that culture is a way of organizing cities, is a way of curating cities. And in fact, it's the way to help reimagine the kind of cities we want in the future. Because, of course, we're sitting here now, and I just want to say how incredibly exciting it is for me to be not in London. Yeah? It's great for me to be traveling again and to be meeting people and seeing what's happening in other parts of the world. And of course, what's happening in your city is extraordinary, just the level of ambition and aspiration. It's to be highly commended. And what I'm trying to do with this is just really, really make the argument that culture's as important as the economy, as important as health, as important as infrastructure, and policymakers need to think of it as that incredible resource to draw on. And of course, when I say these things, I'm basically going back to the future, aren't I? Because, you know, the fact that I have to say them at all, as though it's some kind of corrective, is absolutely crazy, because what we all know that cities across history were built around culture, just as much as they were built around commerce and around finance. You know, anyone who's studied the history of cities and looks at, so for example, Greek civilization, will understand that the core concept of the Greek city was the concept of the agora, you know, the marketplace. And of course, it's more than just a marketplace. It's the place where essentially you have finance, trade, cultural activity. It's the public space in which all the people in the city come together to make decisions. And I've always been very struck by Aristotle said, men come together, and he meant men, literally. Today we would say people, yeah? Men come together in cities to live, and by that he meant you come to a city because it's an opportunity to develop, or you come to a city out of need, desperation sometimes. I'm thinking about the Ukraine, and people are going to be arriving in London over the next few weeks. And then he said, men stay in cities to live the good life. And I love that idea, that, you know, you stay there. Once you've got there with your family, with all these other people, what you're actually doing in that city is you're engaged in this collective project of self-realization, of community development, of community building. And of course, that's what's so inspiring. I remember reading this stuff when I was a young man. What's so inspiring about that Aristotelian view of the city is it's so noble. You know, the cities are kind of like almost like a sort of ethical project about getting everyone to sort of move up Maslow's hierarchy, as Chetana was saying yesterday. So before I go on to my three big changes, my three big trends, I just want to say a little bit more about the position of culture in city policy making. So I would say, without exception, all of our cities in our World Cities Culture Forum network, that's the main list of things that the mayor has to worry about. That's the main list of things that are on the City Hall agenda. And culture's there now. Culture's on the list. In a way that it certainly wasn't 10, 12 years ago. When I started my career 25 years ago, culture was basically seen as either a sort of minority interest of the middle classes or some interesting community projects going on down in the tenements. It wasn't seen as this resource, if you like, for development. But the good news is that that's where it sits these days. And if you're a well-informed mayor and you're surrounded by your advisors and your technocrats and you're getting good advice from the cultural leaders, this is the kind of mental framework you're working off. I apologize for this very consultancy-looking graph, right? And this is what I would be saying if I was talking to a mayor. I'd be saying, okay, you know, if you were going to sort of think about the way culture plays out across your policy agenda, the first thing is stop thinking about culture in a totally instrumental way, which is culture's only for economic or social benefit. You've got to actually build your cultural infrastructure, build your cultural capacity. That takes thinking about how culture's valuable for its own sake, and it needs platforms and ecosystems. So don't lose sight of that. But at the same time, just remember that when you invest in this stuff, when you develop this stuff, whether it's the government, whether it's business, whether it's civil society, you're going to achieve a whole load of economic outcomes around jobs, around innovation. You're going to going to achieve social outcomes around health, around social cohesion. There's a lot more evidence for the economic impact of culture than there is for the social impact of culture, I should say, but the evidence base is growing all the time. But crucially, you're going to really make a difference to your city as a place, the perceptions of the place and how it operates as a place. And that's going to happen not just at the city level, but really all the way down to the neighbourhood level. And I'm going to come back to this issue about individual places, because one of the big trends in urban governance and urban management overall across the world is essentially the sort of devolution of power and management to a very, very local level. And this has been accelerated, incidentally, by the pandemic, because, of course, what people discovered was they discovered that you actually have to manage public health issues and lockdown issues and all these other sort of local economic issues at a very, very local level. One of the sort of mysteries, and I think it doesn't quite apply to Riyadh in the way it does a lot of other cities, one of the great mysteries of human history and of this history of cities is the way we managed to plonk onto city governance almost the same system that we plonked onto the governance of a state, even though a city's a very different kind of creature from a country. So, you have, like departments, and you have specialisms. It's a very, very kind of siloed, whereas, of course, cities have to be managed not as individual activities, but actually as places. And that's one of the reasons why I think culture's advanced so quickly in urban agendas, is because that's actually also a really smart way of managing and developing culture and cultural ecosystems in your city. So that's your kind of overall mind frame. I'm now going to talk a little bit about my three trends, and this has slightly surprised me. So the first thing I want to talk about is just really how the sort of what we call cultural infrastructure, or you might call cultural platforms, or cultural ecosystem, how it's kind of opening out and spreading out. And I've just got a really good example for you here. And I hope you will indulge me. This actually isn't an example from one of the cities in my network. This is an example from a friend of mine who's a curator in Rotterdam Museum. And it's the story of a woman who lives in a sort of low-income neighborhood in Rotterdam. And her name is Lois Veenstra. And she is an obsessive knitter most of her life. And they discovered, through another project they were doing, that you actually couldn't move around her little flat because there was just basically knitted sweaters. She had 550 sweaters of her own design in her flat. So to cut a long story short, that woman now has, her collection is now in the Rotterdam Museum. And this is the catalogue. And they did this amazing project with Lois to celebrate Lois's creative achievement, where they basically went to her street and everyone dressed up in the jumpers that she'd made. And they had a kind of, I believe young people call it a flash mob. So you know what I was talking about earlier about the way cultural forms change? Flash mob's like a sort of new form of festival, isn't it? Which didn't exist 15 years ago. I actually have been to a flash mob myself. I'm just pretending not to know about flash mobs. I'm not sure whether we've got the video, but I think the video is rather lovely, so I hope we can show it. Yeah, that's clever of it. Do we have the video? One more slide, okay. Oh, that's gone back. Excuse the Dutch. Those are all her jumpers. And that's Lois. Can you imagine? Living on her own, a widow. Thanks. I think we can move on if that's okay. Thanks. So what I love about that project is just the way it's a museum operating like a museum. So it's collecting and curating. It's making choices about what's culturally significant, what's not. But it's working with a old lady in a low-income neighborhood with the stuff that she has produced herself, and which they deem to have cultural and social significance. And it's celebrating it in an interesting way. It's animating the area, it's activating activity. It's related to a whole series of other kinds of activities. And I think it's just to illustrate my point that sense of opening up, that sense of cultural institutions no longer just being able to rely on their kind of institutional privilege, but having to be kind of socially relevant, that's a hugely important trend, and we're seeing that across every single city. And I think, there is a kind of a social contract, if you like, between institutions in a city, particularly cultural institutions, and the people of a city, and that social contract involves the notion of relevance, And I think we're going to see that increasingly important, particularly at the sort of at the city level. So what I want to talk a bit now is about how that concept also has a kind of a physical dimension to it and a kind of a spatial dimension to it. And I want to look at two examples, one from London and one from Montreal. Not quite sure what's happened to that picture, but anyway, we know what that is, don't we? That's the most visited contemporary art museum in the world, which opened about 21 years ago. And it's in a part of London that 30 years ago nobody ever went to and was pretty depressed. And it was an area of really high unemployment, needed a huge amount of investment in it. And most Londoners didn't even know there was an old power station there. And now, 21 years later, that's a really, really vibrant part of London, economically successful, with a huge cultural profile. And what I'm going to suggest to you is that the reason why the Tate's so successful and the reason why it's making such a positive contribution to London is because it's never been conceived of just as a cultural institution or as a single building. It's been perceived as almost like a chess piece in a larger area. So not many people know this, and why should they? Because they're just going to go there and enjoy art. But the Tate's always been part of this part of London called Bankside. And Bankside's a whole series of different cultural activities and cultural buildings and cultural platforms of different sizes and shapes, including, the famous Avenue of Art. The slightly newer is the Low Line. There's a bridge going across the river to St. Paul's, which is another really big attraction. That's now connected, doesn't show in this slide, to another sort of cultural area around the Barbican, which has been branded as the Culture Mile. And it's essentially a kind of a process of area-based urban regeneration as well as a cultural project. And the thing that's important about it is that in doing that, the Tate Modern shares responsibility with lots and lots of other organisations in that area for the area. And it allows those other organisations to influence its own governance decisions and its own artistic decisions. So there have been quite a few bits of the Tate programme that are very focused on local activity and local audiences. So it's a very different concept of a museum from a traditional, so say 19th or 18th century concept of a museum. It's more of a sort of it's a cultural district approach, isn't it? And the key thing is the way the activity is managed and governed. And of course, the other thing that's interesting, which I'll come on to in a minute, is of course that the Tate, as an institution, started off in SW1, 2 miles up the river. But it's extended its brand, if you like, or has extended its footprint to this part of London. And as those of you who know the UK will know well, the Tate's also extended its footprint to 2 other cities. Well, 1 city and then 1 small place here in Cornwall. So you can see how it becomes a kind of a chess piece for regeneration and sort of reimagining a place. Now, the city, I think, that's taken this idea of a quarter or of culture as a sort of area-based activity to the most interesting, almost extreme, is the city of Montreal. And that's got an amazing sort of city centre space called the Quartier des Spectacles, which is basically a huge stage for the city. It's a huge public square that's programmed as a stage for the city. It is a cultural district in the sense that you can see on the list there, you've got quite a lot of cultural platforms and cultural institutions there, but they are managed. They have a certain level of independence in terms of how they're programmed and how they're governed, but they're managed as a collective around this central space. And they come together to co-program that central space, and they also have people from all around the city, from cultural organizations all around the city, as part of that programming and governance process. So you actually have lots of activity taking place within the Quartier des Spectacles from other parts of the city. And to me, if I was going to sort of say what's a model for a kind of a city's kind of cultural infrastructure or cultural platforms, I always think this is like a brilliant model, because you've got individual cultural organizations of different kinds, but essentially they see themselves as this kind of this amazing platform for the whole city. And I think it's kind of almost like symbolic of the way any city in the future is going to be thinking about its cultural infrastructure. And these are just some images. Obviously has a huge influence on the nighttime economy in Montreal. Anybody here been to Montreal? One person, yeah. Montreal, I mean, Quebec is an absolutely stunning place, isn't it? Because you've got 4 million French North Americans who've essentially kind of managed to develop a very distinctive, very specific culture in the middle of this vast continent where the culture is pretty much, you know, the general culture in North America is much more bland and sort of mixed, whereas they've kept their cultural identity while being very internationally connected, and they've turned culture into an incredibly successful economic export with performing arts and immersive. So one of the things I should just mention about this as well is that it has quite an interesting creative industries or creative economy angle to it as well, because they have this big space that they program. They've developed a cluster of about 50 companies who are specialized in sort of immersive entertainment, immersive technologies, and they're in demand all over the world. So that's if you like, kind of like a real model. And I think what we're seeing across all cities, and you'll be familiar with it here in Riyadh because you're taking a similar approach, is that it's increasingly common to plan for culture generally around the idea of quarters or districts. There are some downsides to that. We can maybe talk about that in our discussion. I talked to Chetana about it. And in our work, we've identified 4 very distinct types. You've got, you know, the ones on the left-hand side, which are deliberately planned, and they tend to either have a historic dimension. So you take your historic cultural infrastructure and you design a sort of district governance framework around it. You've got the new ones. I suppose you could say that Diriyah Gate here is almost like a mixture of both, isn't it? You've got your kind of historic infrastructure and you're building a kind of a new modern sort of visitor and destination infrastructure around it. And then you've got the ones that are a bit less planned. We've used the word opportunistic, but they're the ones that grow a little bit more organically. Soho in London is probably the best one, example from London of the top one. But in the bottom, every city's got that place on the edge of the centre, you know, where the sort of informal activity develops and becomes interesting, and artists move in there. But this notion of the kind of spatial dimension of cities and culture and it opening out, I think, is the key point I want to make. The other thing I would say is that there's also a push, and this happened even before the pandemic, there's a push to develop cultural activity and cultural platforms outside the centre. And almost every one of the cities that we work with has got some kind of program or some kind of budget that's about doing specific work in specific neighbourhoods, not on their own, but somehow trying to kind of connect that back to the city centre. You notice in what I said about Montreal and the Quartier des Spectacles, they actually have that approach of, it's not just about local neighbourhood development, it's about highlighting what's going on in that neighbourhood to the whole city and giving it sort of a citywide prominence. And there are lots and lots of examples of that. Apologies for the quality of that. Up in the top, that's the Deputy Mayor for Culture and Creative Industries of London, Justine Simons, with our Mayor, Sadiq Khan. And they're launching, with David Shrigley, the artist, they're launching something called London Borough of Culture, which is like European City of Culture, but for local neighbourhoods in London. And I went to one of the events for the latest one, which is a South London borough called Lewisham, and it took place in Piccadilly Circus. And they were projecting the activities that were going on down in the borough on the main screen in Piccadilly Circus. So opening out, spreading out, that's the trend. And the thing about that is, and the reason why I think that's really, really important in the current context is because the broader trends in urban development, as we go into the future, post-pandemic, we're going to have to rethink how we live in cities, how we move around cities, how we move between cities. The broader trend, I think, is a trend of sort of decentralization. Centres will still be important. It's still going to be important to have important, iconic cultural institutions, but more and more and more, the way cultural infrastructure and cultural platforms are going to develop is essentially to open them out and to spread them out. And that's, you can argue about this, but I would say that's a more sustainable model in terms of the environment and, the city as part of the environment. But it's also, I think, a more sustainable model in terms of how you build cultural ecosystems that aren't too focused in one place or too reliant on one set of activities, but you build those across the city. This is another example in Seoul, which is one of our members, where what they've done something that's very South Korea, so it's actually quite top-down. They've identified a series of old industrial buildings across different parts of the different neighborhoods, and they've kind of programmed them as different kinds of cultural organizations. So you can see that there's one that's dedicated to health, one that's dedicated to literature, one that's dedicated to arts and disability, but it's a very, very deliberate process of trying to develop these things across the city. Great city, by the way, Seoul. Who's been to Seoul? Right. One of the reasons why Seoul's such a good city is because it's incredibly well organized. It's incredibly sort of well managed. It's huge, it's incredibly populated, but you always feel that the tempo is good. It's not too slow, but it's kind of manageable, and you always feel safe, and you always feel comfortable. And the reason I say this is because, and this is just a little bit of a pause. I'm not going to copy Chetana, but I'm just going to, Chetana had this great moment in her talk last night where she sort of asked us all to think about a place that we loved, that we can remember and that we think about, and what kind of place that is, which you can do now if you want. And what I can guarantee you, if you took the time to analyze it, or if you hired my company to analyze it for you, what I can guarantee is that it would be a really interesting combination of very well organized in a systematic way, but also a place which has a kind of a feel to it, a kind of a, can't really put my finger on it, but it feels comfortable, it feels human-centered, it feels convivial. And the word for that is empathy. I've stolen this idea from a writer called Charlie Leadbeater, who I know Corey's met. And it's actually, this frame of reference is actually taken from psychology, and particularly the study of autism. But we use it at BOP quite a lot because it's simple, but it's so brilliant, And you can see, can't you, how it's possible to be a city where you invest a huge amount of money in places, including your cultural capacity, and you can be extremely well organized systematically, but you might lack a little bit of that feel, that kind of vibe. That's another word for it, vibe, usually what I do in this part of the presentation is I put cities into that matrix, but I was told by my office that I shouldn't do that. I should stop doing that because it's rude to some cities. But it'd be worth thinking about where you want Riyadh to be in that calculation. I think empathy is a good word when it comes to thinking about culture and cities, when it comes to thinking about art and artists, is because one of the things, artists I know there are some artists in the audience. Artists are terribly difficult people sometimes. I'm married to one, yeah. And then, as the UAP will know, they're incredibly, almost impossible to manage. But the one thing they really are good at is they're really good at empathy. They're really good at sort of somehow tuning into, picking up on the spirit of the times, the spirit of the place. They're sort of tuned into that part of the spectrum that others of us aren't. They're experts in empathy, I would say. Okay, so now I've talked a little bit about cultural platforms and cultural infrastructure opening out and spreading out. So the second thing I'm going to talk about is about opening out and spreading out as well, but I'm going to talk about that in the sort of digital realm. This is not I'm not going to talk about NFTs and cryptocurrencies and all that kind of stuff, although that stuff is hugely important for the future of artists and the future of cities. I want to talk a little bit, I just want to sort of develop the thinking about culture as a sort of a public good that I've talked about so far and what the implications are. And I actually haven't got lots of examples for you because there aren't that many. And what I'm going to say now is really a kind of thing that's, I think is happening, that's kind of incipient and is about to sort of hit the world big time. And I'm going to show you some graphs, for which I apologize in advance. Being a consultant, I always have graphs. And the reason I'm showing you this publication is because we've just worked, this was published about 4 weeks ago, and we worked on this with our colleagues in UNESCO. We did all the sort of research and analysis behind it. And one of the things that we did is we thought, right, let's take a proper look at where the world is in terms of all these new digital platforms, and what are the implications of that for culture, for the way we live our lives. It's not city-specific, but I think it's kind of quite interesting. And I'm just going to give you a talk through just a selection, just to sort of set the scene. Then I'm going to give you my thoughts on what it means for work, for artists and work, and also and what it also means for public platforms and culture. Everyone I know in Saudi, not everyone, almost everyone I've ever met in Saudi tells me about Saudi and YouTube, and just how much activity there is on YouTube in Saudi, and it's disproportionately large. I mean, look, it's amazing to get Saudi, relatively small country population-wise. Look where it sits there, quite high up if you think about how many countries there are in the world. Yeah, 500 hours of content uploaded to YouTube every minute. Right? That's almost impossible to think about, isn't it? So that's not just watching YouTube, that's uploaded to YouTube. That's big. Something's happening there, isn't there? Which we have to be kind of thinking about. This is penetration. Look at, we have Saudi here as well. So I confess that I can't remember what penetration means exactly, but you're talking about 9 out of 10 people in this country are regular users or regular consumers. YouTube. This, I think, is really interesting because I think we shouldn't think about this stuff just in terms of consumption, passive consumption. We think about it as platforms for creation as well. And this is a thing that my clever analysts pulled together from various sources, which is people's capabilities to use these technologies. That's a big issue, isn't it? Because it's not just about access to it, which is it's in itself an issue. It's also about your ability to actually use it proactively. And you can see the global total is under half, and in Arab states it's basically the same as the average global total, which I think is actually quite interesting as an observation overall. And then this is a really good one as well. Does everyone here know what GitHub is? GitHub is essentially a platform where you can download tools to make your own stuff. So again, this is about production, creative production on platforms. And these are this is the countries where you saw the greatest increase in usage. It's like almost all the other companies, a US company, but this is where all the activity was. Basically during COVID times, the activities in these countries. So it's not in the northern part of our globe. It's quite often not in the developed part of our globe, if we can use that language. It's in all these places, which you wouldn't necessarily normally associate with that kind of activity. So there's something going on there as well, isn't there? I'm going to come on to talk about my last point in a minute, which is all about sustainability and climate change. But I just wanted to reflect on that information around digital platforms and the use of it. I just want to sort of just reflect on two things. The first is really about artists and work. So most artists live and work in cities. If you take a global population, most artists live and work, and they work in cities because that's where the work is, and that's where they can network, and that's where they can meet their dealers and their customers. And in most cities across the world, the percentage of people who work in the creative industries is between 5 and 12%, in most larger cities, anyway. The pandemic was devastating for the artistic community in every city, even in Chinese cities. Yeah? And in the piece of work we've just done for UNESCO, based on various sources of data, we calculated that 10 million jobs were effectively lost across the cultural and creative industries across the world. Yeah? Now, when I say they were lost, that doesn't mean that they were completely lost, because there were also, a proportion of that 10 million will have been supported by government schemes, although, of course, quite a lot of people fell through the net, particularly if you're a freelancer. So that's a sort of like a real challenge and a real issue at the moment, which is essentially that the pandemic had a devastating effect on the ecosystem and on, artists living in cities. But I can virtually guarantee you that it'll come back. And one of the reasons it'll come back is because of what I'm going to say about sustainability, is because cities need artists. But I think it's also an opportunity for sort of redrawing the map of culture and creative employment. And I haven't got any figures to back this up. This is mostly anecdotal from people I've spoken to in my own observations, is that one of the interesting things about the pandemic for artists, as indeed for lots and lots of independent workers, is that it showed the possibility of having a career and having a dynamic relationship with colleagues and with customers without necessarily having to be where all the commissioners and where all the publishers and where all the galleries are. Yeah? You don't necessarily have to be in London or Paris or Beijing. You can have a practice. It can be studio-based. It can be socially focused. You can have a practice. You can make a life. You can make a career whilst living in a range of different places. So I'm not just talking digital nomads, because that's obviously a phenomenon. I'm talking about kind of like artistic residence. I'm talking about the fact that if you're a young artist and you're in England at the moment and you graduated, from St. Martin's 3 years ago, there's a sort of thing in your head where you can see yourself operating out of the city of Derby in a way that you wouldn't have been able to see yourself operating out of the city of Derby 2 or 3 years ago. And I really think there is a big change of mindset. And I think that's true across the world as well, the idea that it's possible to operate. And it's incredibly good news, if you think about it, for the non-large cities. The cities aren't necessarily seen at the moment as cultural hubs. It's a really, really big opportunity. And the second thing I wanted to just focus on is that what happened over the pandemic is that a lot of the cultural organisations, the kind I was mentioning earlier, they reached out on digital platforms. And they basically managed to keep in touch with their audience through digital platforms. The evidence in the UK and the US is that they didn't really win lots of new audience, new types of people. They basically kept their existing audience, yeah? And obviously, that's another side of the opening out equation that I'm talking about, which is essentially using digital platforms. But I think the really big, interesting question for cities, and I think it's going to define the geography of culture and creativity in the future, is what's the new public digital platforms that you're going to develop that are relevant to your city? One of the big, there are obviously platforms out there, but how are we going to connect those big global platforms and city development, city growth, and what's happening culturally in your city? Chetana gave a really, really interesting example in her talk yesterday of a fantastic project which Artichoke Productions did in London, which is essentially, it was 1599. It was like a 1660, sorry, I don't know my history. It was a kind of a recreation of the Great Fire of London. So they built a model of the city and then it went up in flames. And the capacity, the crowd capacity for that amazing event was 50,000 people, but they had 1.5 million people coming in on platforms, various platforms, didn't they? Now, that's a moment, isn't it, where the physical cultural platforms of your city and the digital sort of come together. And I don't think we've even started to explore and understand the potential of that. And I think what's so exciting about it for cities across the world is that you know, you don't, to have that kind of platform, you do not need the kind of massive investment, capital investment of physical space, and you don't need the huge amount of time it takes. You can create those relatively cheaply, and you can reach very, very large numbers of people. And so it's almost as if, you know, there's a new possibility now for cities that don't necessarily have a highly developed cultural infrastructure, who might want to build their cultural platforms and their cultural ecosystem, to develop that using a really interesting mixture of physical and digital means. And I don't think we've even started to see the full possibilities of that. And one of the challenges I would put out there to policymakers and to artists and to great organizations like UAP is, you know, there's an opportunity there to take the lead and to explore that in interesting ways, and all kinds of great things could happen. All right, I'm going to start finishing now. I think I'm okay for time. Let's have a good glass of water. So, cities occupy 2% of the surface of the Earth, but they're responsible for 80% of energy production and 60% of emissions. So cities are at the forefront of what we need to do about environmental sustainability and climate change. And all cities know this, and all mayors are now tuned into this. You know, we know from COP26 that, you know, there's sort of an alignment at a national level that we've never seen before. I would say, having worked on this agenda for 5 years now, it's been there amongst mayors for a long, long time. Now, I'm basing my comments on this report that we produced for COP26 last year. I'm very proud of the title, by the way, The Green World Cities of Tomorrow, because those of you who know about cities will know that that's actually a sort of a quote from a very famous publication at the end of the 19th century called The Garden Cities of Tomorrow by a guy called Ebenezer Howard, which is like trying to imagine cities as places where people could like live almost like a rural existence, but in the city, on the edge of cities. But anyway, and this is really looking at what cities are doing to introduce a new, more sustainable way of living. And what I want to do is I just want to show you 4 examples of what's happening amongst our cities at the sort of policy level to take on this agenda. Because, you know, essentially cities are on a urgent mission to deal with this. You know, most cities are basically saying that they're going to be carbon neutral by 2050. It's an absurdly ambitious target. So I'm not going to talk about all of these. I'm just going to pick two of these out. So the first one is the city of Chengdu in China. Anybody here been to Chengdu? One of the best city in China, really beautiful, chilled out place. It's like the San Francisco of China. I'm sure they won't mind me saying that. And what they've done is they've conceived of a new kind of city infrastructure that's essentially both cultural infrastructure and green, environmentally friendly infrastructure. And essentially they see themselves as a park. And what they're doing is they're developing a way of moving around the city, which is essentially through green routes. Bicycles, walking, small electronic mobile sort of carriers. And they're going to build, check this out, 10,000 kilometers of these routes around their city. I mean, remember, it's a Chinese city, so it's absolutely it's vast. And what I love about this thinking is it's all about trying to sort of rethink the city as cultural infrastructure, but as green infrastructure. And thinking about a greenway, almost like a cultural platform, because along all these greenways, there'll be amphitheatres, there'll be performances, there'll be public art of all different kinds. It's just an amazingly ambitious, really top-level way of trying to kind of reimagine what a city would be. Not ring roads, although I'm not saying ring roads are going to go away. We're always going to need ring roads, but ring greenways that encourage a different way of thinking about moving around the city. The other one I want to give you an example of very quickly is in Oslo, where they have the city has a climate budget. So what they do is they account for their emissions in the same way they account for their public expenditure. And this has quite a big implication for their cultural budget. So if they're going to build a new opera house, for example, they will not be able to build that new opera house if they have to build a big parking structure next to it, because that'll go over their budget for emissions. So it's sort of, they therefore have to think, well, what do I do instead of building a new opera house? Maybe I have to build it in a different place. Maybe I have 3 smaller opera places around the city. So the budget dictates what you can do with your cultural infrastructure. But the real point I want to make is it's all very well for mayors and policymakers to set targets. It's all very, very well for them to have these interesting initiatives. But in the end, and it's all very well for them to run PR campaigns and to hire expensive communication professionals to frighten the life out of their citizens. But in the end, the city, as a group of people, has to internalize this issue and has to themselves participate in a process of thinking about how to live in the city, how to live in the city. That's the only way it's going to work. And my argument would be that, mayors, they can't do it unless they've got their artists and their creative communities to help them do that. Because actually it's not just a question of the systematic change, it's a question of the empathetic change, just to go back to our systems and empathy point. And this is just one example of an artist's work. And there are countless examples. I was actually talking to Michaela earlier about one which I won't have time to talk about. And this is an amazing artist called Eve Mosher. And what she did, this is 10, 12 years ago, is she basically had a project where she tried to draw a white line around the island of Manhattan to show where the water would go if the predicted sea rise would happen from climate change. And I forget, it was like 3 meters or something like that. I don't know whether you saw the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change published a report yesterday, disappeared amongst all the news of Ukraine, where they say 1 billion people's lives are at risk, or 1 billion people will be affected at the moment, I think in 20 years' time, from sea level rises, because most big cities are in coastal areas. So what she did to sort of raise awareness is she had this thing where she literally drew a line around Manhattan, which this is where the water's going to come to. Yeah? And you can see from these little rods here, in Central Park, she had a sort of temporary public art exhibition, and those rods, they mark where the water would be if it rose to its highest level. That's where the Central Park would basically be underwater. Yeah? So it's very simple. It's not preaching at you. It's not trying to make you think something. It's just suggesting to you in an empathetic, creative way that we might have to kind of rethink what's going on here. These are the consequences of what we're doing. Everyone in Saudi knows LC, don't they? What an artist, what a guy. I went to a studio in Dubai in December. I was almost in tears. And this piece of work in Cairo, just absolutely a stunning piece of sort of social civic activism. Do I need to explain it? Does everyone know what this is? Yeah. But essentially, he's putting the spotlight in this incredible way on this community of people in the city who invented the circular economy before the circular economy existed. And again, what I love about this piece of work, not only its beauty and its kind of deep cultural relevance, because that's actually, that script there is a saying from a Coptic bishop of the 14th century. It's all about wiping your eyes so you can see the sunshine. But what I love about this is that it's suggesting something so deep about the city and the way that people live in the city and the kind of crisis that we're in. But it's beautiful and communicative. It's not hectoring or didactic. And there are countless examples of this happening all over the world. So I promised you I realize my time's running a bit short now. And I thought I'd just finish with some thoughts. So my own personal view, and it's actually my conviction, is that we are in a big turning point post-pandemic across the world. And from the point of view of what I do, which is I'm interested in cities as sort of cultural entities and what happens, I think the map has basically been changing rapidly for the last 10, 15 years, and I think it's changing even more rapidly. And I think we're going to see like a totally different pattern across the world in terms of, artistic activity, cultural infrastructure. It's a really, really big opportunity for cities all over the world. I was saying to somebody yesterday, I find it astonishing that UNESCO, which has a Creative Cities program where it recognises a city for a particular art form, it only has 234 cities. What's going on? I mean, there are 500 cities in the world of a population of over 1 million. Yeah? There are 10,000 cities in the world, as defined by OECD, with a population of over 50,000 and a population density of over 1,500 people per kilometre. There should be thousands and thousands of creative cities. And I believe there will be. I think the map will change. I think there'll be dots. The dots will be appearing everywhere, and there's going to be a redefinition of culture and creativity across the world. And this is my final slide, which I hope will echo with the first slide. So this is the median age. We won't go into details now. You can ask the statisticians later, of people on these respective continents. And it's worth thinking about these numbers in relation to the slide I showed you at the beginning, isn't it? Because this is the future. I've talked about 3 things which I think are going to reshape culture in cities and culture across cities, and it's partly going to be driven by this demographic phenomenon, which is a staggering demographic phenomenon, including your country, your city, in terms of its age profile. So I think I've probably overdone my time. Thank you very much. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Paul. I think we were all very pleased that you went over your time. It was a fascinating and interesting presentation. It brought to mind to me a few questions that we ask ourselves as people. There are 3 questions in life that all of you will ask yourself, and all of you will have to make decisions. Firstly, what do you want to do? Secondly, where do you want to do it? And who do you want to do it with? As we curate our cities, we take to heart the word curate, which means to care. Essentially, curate comes from the very basis of our civilization. It's about caring about people. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce Ms. Dina Amin, who is the Director of the Visual Arts Commission, to talk about the vision for the visual arts and how we curate a city that you'll make questions and decisions about how you stay. Thank you.
Yes, okay. مساء الخير جميعاً. I'll be speaking in English if that's okay. Right. I think, sorry, excuse the laptop. Ironically, I work in the Visual Arts Commission, but I seem to need vision. So forgive me, I don't have glasses yet, but I'm sure they're coming. I think, having listened to what Paul was discussing, I'm obviously not talking about cities, but I'm talking about visual arts and how visual arts can contribute to cities. There were a number of really important and poignant points that were mentioned by Paul that I might highlight before talking a little bit about what I'll be showing you on these slides, and I'll do it briefly. I know my timeline is shorter. But it was interesting for me to hear how culture is now regarded as a major infrastructure element alongside economy, transportation, healthcare, innovation, environment, safety, security, housing, infrastructure, and regeneration. I made a list. I was a good student. And I think one of the really remarkable things is how Vision 2030 is really driven by that same principle, and how the leadership of this nation has really embraced this idea at its core in terms of everything that we're all collectively working towards achieving. So that really is, for me, something incredibly important to note. I also think that it's really poignant to mention that, as you said, Paul, city, as a group of people, a city made up by a group of people is what determines how we live in a city, and that integration is very important, and that through that integration we bring together these different puzzle pieces. So just those were some very big themes that I thought were particularly relevant and important to where I was going to go. So maybe before I start talking about some of the things that relate to public art, I should maybe just highlight who we are as a commission. The Visual Arts Commission is a commission under the Ministry of Culture, one of 11 commissions dedicated to servicing the cultural industry or the cultural ecosystem in Saudi Arabia. We, as a Visual Arts Commission, are dedicated to nurturing the talent of the full ecosystem, practitioners, professionals, whatever that might look like, and to support all of the different steps in that ecosystem, whatever that might look like. I'm not going to read this for you. You can, it's in front of you. Feel free. But at the heart of all of that is preserving our heritage, and you touched on this, Paul, the idea of heritage and history, but also celebrating our current state, our present, and then imagining what our future could be. And these were all maybe themes that were part of your conversation. But how are we going to do that, and who are we? We are looking at specific forms of cultural engagement, and in particular visual arts. And how are we defining visual arts? We're defining visual arts, and again, the reason we define this is there are 11 cultural commissions, each of which has a mandate. Each mandate slightly differs on the other, but together we complete the full picture and the whole story. But visual arts is looking specifically at the idea of maybe more artistic practices, that focus on painting, photography for artistic purposes, sculpture, calligraphy, again, as a means of expression, installation art, digital and video art, multimedia art, and whatever the future brings. We don't stop at anything. We know that, things will evolve and things will continue to develop, and that's okay. I have to drive two things here. That's using all of my brain sides. We have a vision whereby, again, when we developed our strategy as a Visual Arts Commission, we thought about the A to Z of what is the journey that any practitioner will take, again, whether they are an artist, a curator, or anything in the world of visual arts practitioners. The vision is one that really looks at creating a visual arts hub that elevates local art appreciation, provides growth opportunities for homegrown talent, and empowers practitioners internationally, but with a national and inclusive spirit. And I think, again, this is speaking to that trend and all of those important factors that you're talking about, the cities of today and the future. And of course, as a commission, we have a mission to enable all of that through that to evolve maybe organically, I should say, and really activate community expression and dialogue, and the idea of us as a commission serving as a catalyst for creative and sustainable economy. So, how are we going to do this? We have three main themes, and these are all going to feed into public art, and that's why I highlight them. I'm not talking just to talk. Three main themes, and these are all part of public art. Visual arts are going to be, in our mind, a conduit for community and interactive expression, very important, feeding into everything that's happening, Vision 2030, what Paul was mentioning, and all of the different things that we are all collectively aspiring towards. We want the visual arts to be a tool for dialogue and engagement, telling the stories that we need to tell to be able to engage with the people that we need to engage with locally, regionally, and globally. And again, we need to think about the creative economy. We do need to be able to make sure that we have a sustainable creative economy that empowers that part of our society that will help the future of Saudi Arabia, and all that will, and whatever that will look like. Now, we're very lucky. We have an amazing history with public art. An amazing history. We had a very, very forward-looking mayor in Jeddah in the let's say 1980s, I want to say. Dr. Mohammed Farsi was highly ahead of his time in many ways. He really took a very proactive approach to engaging with the idea of designing, let's say, and driving cultural engagement in urban spaces. And he worked with an international artist called Julio Lafuente, and together there was a plan that was hatched to really beautify the city through the engagement with multiple works of art in very, very accessible public spaces. Now, the number, I think, is over 600 sculptures. These sculptures were located and continue to be located around streets, squares, and other public places. And they have played an incredibly important role in not only beautifying the space and the area and the urban landscape, but also in terms of creating a sense of identity, a sense of pride, a sense of community and belonging, and driving economy. You know, I have personal memories of having no idea where I was in the city of Jeddah until I saw something, and then all of a sudden I knew. All of a sudden the picture clarified, and I knew exactly where I was. Or you would meet at X, Y, and Z landmark because that's where you were going to leave from to go somewhere else or to have a picnic or whatever it was. But public art has a very, very, very important role. Now, it's not just in the past, it's in the future as well, and in the present. There are lots of things that are happening currently in Saudi Arabia that engage the idea and notion of public art and the idea of engaging the public realm. I'm not going to talk about these things. We have Ilaria coming now to speak after me, and she will be no doubt going into a lot of detail about the program that the Royal Commission for Riyadh City has with Noor Riyadh and other initiatives. And of course, the Royal Commission of Al-Ula has plans, and we're aware of Desert X. The Visual Arts Commission has plans too, but they're not, they're coming soon to a place near you. Stay tuned. Now, I'm just going to skip here. This, I think, is very important. We have a vision and a mission for public art. We do have a public art approach that we will be engaging with. But the mission for me is particularly important, of course, because it speaks again to many of the things that we just discussed. The idea of sustainable public art projects that integrate into an urban landscape, again, a piece of a puzzle, that engage local civic and artistic communities, that enable arts and culture organizations. So again, we're piecing this puzzle together, and elevate the understanding of the arts which enrich people's lives. Thinking about how all of these pieces stitch together to form the whole that will drive the cities of the future. Just again, touching on the idea of a public arts program and what that could look like, this is how we've defined the mission for the Visual Arts Commission and how we want to engage with the notion of art moving forward. Public art has changed over the years, and the way in which we engage with public art has changed over the years. We looked at a historical engagement in Jeddah. There are many things that are coming in the future. Ilaria will talk a little bit about what they're doing through the Royal Commission of Riyadh City. But at the same point in time, there are shared characteristics. And we've tried to categorize or summarize these shared characteristics in a few different boxes. I'm sure there's more to it than this, but on a high level, I think public art today serves many purposes, and one of these purposes is for it to be mission-driven and purposeful. What are we trying to say with public art? What does it do? What does it bring? We're not looking just to decorate. We're looking to activate. And why are we activating, and how are we activating? And this goes back to what Paul said about city as a group of people determining how we live. How do we live? It's part of an urban fabric, an urban landscape, and a part of how we as communities come together to exist in any given space or experience a space. So purposeful and mission-driven. Again, it is a form of art, so it does need to have an aesthetic engagement. So we've identified another characteristic or categorization as being diverse in scale and representation of different artistic types of engagement. Artists work in different media, in different forms, in different formats, in different shapes and sizes, and that's all fine. This is about a creative expression, and how do we engage with that creative expression in any given space? Very important. I think one of the other things that was touched upon in the digital section of what Paul was saying was this idea of interactive and engaging artwork. Now, interactive can mean many different things. Maybe the way of the future is really looking at the idea of technology and and what that could look like. But interactive can mean many different things, but it's the idea of bringing communities together, and how do we bring communities together to rally around a space, to create this sense of belonging, to create this sense of purpose and this sense of pride. There's no doubt that public art contributes to economy, both in terms of drawing an audience to the work of art itself, whatever it might be, but also in terms of activating spaces that exist around any form of work of public art. So thinking about the economic opportunity that comes from invigorating maybe a particular space that has not been activated for some time, bringing back life to a square that maybe has been abandoned or left to become derelict for whatever reason, bringing people into a space that does not see footfall in the same way that it might have once, or that it never had and now will. There are many examples in the world of what this looks like. The Tate was, it's not a public artwork, but it is in some ways, I guess. Tate in London was referenced as an example. Obviously, the Bean in Chicago is another well-known example, and Guggenheim Bilbao and many other places in the world. So these are all examples of how public art can really contribute to the positive evolution of an economic situation in any particular environment. Tourism is important. Whether it's local tourism, regional tourism, or international tourism, art destinations are really big and important parts of our communities. And that is something we do have to think about and have to engage and embrace. Now, none of this happens alone. We can't do all of this in a vacuum. We all have to think about effective partnerships and sponsorships. How do we, again, going back to the idea of community and society, how do we work together to make sure that we are doing this in the most positive and impactful way? That doesn't mean big corporations only. It means the people that live in any particular environment. Any public artwork needs to do exactly what it says on the tin. It needs to be public, and it needs to engage that community as well as other communities and mushroom from there and cascade from there. So the idea of partnership with local community, the idea of sponsorship from local businesses and artists and other creative economy practitioners and so on, it's very, very important. And lastly, but not least, digital. We all know that digital is more and more prevalent in everything that we're doing. We're seeing incredible leaps and bounds in terms of what that looks like and how we engage in our daily lives. I look at my children doing, they're little, they're very young, doing things that I don't know how to do, and I'm shocked and slightly embarrassed on a daily basis. But it is the way of the future, and we need to think about that, especially as we're thinking about carbon footprints and how we can think about really creating resonance around our different engagements, maybe in a way that doesn't involve everyone getting on a plane in the same way, but that maybe has been done in the past. But I think digital speaks to some of those issues, as well as the idea of interactive and future thinking. I only have 2 more slides, so don't worry, I won't talk for much longer. But again, thinking about these different buckets in which public art can fall, we're thinking about what are these what are the important themes that need to come out of those buckets. There were 7 buckets that we highlighted on the previous page, but they all speak to maybe some of the themes that we're seeing in the world today. Environmental responsibility, the idea of engaging nature, whatever that might look like. Nature can mean many different things, but nature in what's happening, so that you aren't parachuting in things that really don't belong in their environment. They need to talk to in their environment. That conversation, that dialogue can mean many different things. It doesn't have to match. It can be the source or the catalyst for conversation, but there does need to be some sort of engagement. The idea of being regenerative and transformative, 2 words I cannot say today, is very important, because public art does contribute to society, and society needs to be able to engage with public art. So these things speak to each other, culturally relevant. And this, I think, is very important. Going back to, thinking about what we as a Visual Arts Commission will do, we want to embrace the past, the present, and the future. And how do we make sure that what we are doing through public art is relevant to our society, our culture, in a way that speaks to us and who we are. Last of all, the last slide, Again, this is just to reemphasize the idea of public art having a huge amount of impact. Public art sits in many different places in society. Sometimes it becomes the landmark, sometimes it's near the landmark, sometimes it's a tourist destination, sometimes there are activities around public art that bring together communities and drive society to come together in different ways. There are experiences. All of these things form part of public art and important parts of public art. And at the end of the day, I think you know, the awareness around all of these factors, the aesthetic impact that these public artworks have, and how they all contribute to increasing societal well-being are truly important. And again, you know, thankfully we have an incredibly visionary leadership in this country. Vision 2030 speaks to all of these points, and we look forward as a Visual Arts Commission to being part of that ecosystem and delivering on that for the nation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dina. We've gone from the big picture, looking at world cities, forums, culture and infrastructure, and how culture really is the driving force of who we are as people. We've looked at what that means in terms of a vision for a country in 2030, where the visual component of our cities is how we make meaning of what we see, how we understand and interpret the clues of the place and the behaviour, and the type of people that we want to be. Now I want to bring us down to a project, a massive project in Riyadh, one that my company that I've been working with, UAP, is very proud to have been involved in developing the Public Art Master Plan that is now Riyadh Art. So without further ado, I'd like to bring to our screen tonight Ilaria Bonacossa, who works for the Riyadh Art, and she's the Arts and Culture Liaison for the Royal Commission for Riyadh Art. Hello, Ilaria, welcome. Okay, we need your speaker. Are you on mute?
Good evening, everyone.
Good evening, Ilaria. I'd like to invite you to share your screen and to talk to us now about this amazing project of Riyadh Art that is going to actually bring us down to the actual situation that we are in today in Riyadh. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I will try to be fast to leave some time to the discussion. So Riyadh Art. Riyadh Art is a crucial project for the development and transformation of the city. And the scope of this project is quite unheard of in a global form, because cities have invested in art, but rarely has a city decided to turn the whole city in a museum without walls in a very short amount of time. And this gives a whole acceleration to the system, not only to what the artists are producing, but to the whole infrastructure around what the artists do, who produces the artworks, how are they delivered, conserved, shipped. It's going to really change Riyadh, turning it into a powerhouse for the digital creative age. So the project is based in Riyadh. It spreads from the outskirts of the city all the way through the center. Hearing the presentation before, we were commenting with my colleagues that we absolutely have to insert a map of where the interventions will be, but we are happy to say that it's really spread out in a very broad sense. And the project compromises more than 1,000 public art interventions and 2 major annual festivals that complement these public artworks and that completely transform the city, the residential neighborhoods, the garden, the parks, the squares. And more than that, they try to transform the way that the citizens live the city and how they engage. I think the example of Tate was really poignant, and it's really the type of transformation of how the city is lived that is being envisioned in the project. So the program is really thinking how to transform the city And it really works with different types of artists. The idea is to have from very famous international artists to established artists, both working in the region and internationally, but also to promote Saudi talent and to promote the career of younger artists so that they will start their careers in Riyadh and become relevant for the whole history of art and the global art scene. And the uniqueness of the program is how it really works on the promotion and dissemination of knowledge of contemporary art in the city, transforming how we live. So the objectives are really linked with the vision of the country and the city: create a future legacy, create joyful, accessible, inclusive art, promote Riyadh's culture and entertainment industry, foster and deliver a sustainable creative economy, nurture education and inspiration of the art, and inspire cultural pride and social exchange. The objective are also to build an empowered society, inspire well-being and quality of life, create an interactive city which thrives on a digital future, and this thriving city should enrich the lives of residents and visitors. And obviously it should finally boost Riyadh's ranking as a global city, making it an international creative and cultural hub, even if sometimes I feel we have to be careful in becoming competitive in what cities stand for, because I think it should really be a unique experience, and it's so difficult to compare one city to another. So Riyadh Art represents opportunity to create relationships, benefits, and it really involves the whole city. It involves different sectors, like you see, from tourism to architects, engineer, artists, company, tourism, community, and obviously the opinion leaders. And it really offers opportunities for artists, but I want to skip on to talk about the specific projects which will launch. Here again, we are summarizing the scope and the idea that artists in different phases of their careers will be involved in the program, which is very important because obviously the very famous and established one bring international visibility to the project, but nurturing emerging talents is really what writes art history for the future. And obviously it will involve numerous partners. The scope is so large that it will be enhancing collaborations with local companies, international companies, and even inviting some of these companies to work. The program. Riyadh Art is composed of 10 programs plus 2. The 2 festivals which happen and have already happened and are the ones of which citizens and visitors have had incredible experiences. And from this festival, we have taken some of the images you see in this presentation, and then the other programs which are articulated in different ways and spread around the cities. So I'll walk you quickly through them, and I hope these can be inspiration for our discussion afterwards. So Urban Art Lab. Urban Art Lab is a program which is in the idea of building 4 temporary pavilions that will be also installed in different locations in the city that offer the opportunity to encounter art, but also to encounter the up-and-coming trends of digital art and digital exploration. And they will offer the possibility of engaging with art and engaging also with modern forms of temporary architecture, which are really crucial in the idea of how to build and how to build sustainably. And Joyous Garden is one of the projects I love the most. It's about artists and designers reimagining traditional playgrounds and urban elements all around the cities. The scope of the program is really quite broad. It really is spread through the cities from large parks to middle neighborhood gardens to very small local gardens. And it really plays on the idea that if you encounter art very early in your age, your capacity to engage with art will be much higher, and you will be willing also to develop transversal thinking and a critical way of looking at reality. The Hidden River Illuminated Bridges develops through the wadis, and the idea is to develop these light shows inviting artists and light designers to work on the bridges of the cities, so that moving around the city becomes an occasion to encounter art. And also it's a way of inviting artists to live the local space, to live outdoors, and to look and rediscover their city, because I think this is something crucial of public art. It's how it invites even citizens who know the city very well to look at it with new eyes and rediscover it. The Hidden River Art Trail will also present public sculptures along the wadis and in the center of the city. Some of the sculptures, like the one you see, will be sculptures that come from one of the festival programs, the two-week sculpture program, so that the works that are born for a festival in the city of Riyadh actually find their permanent home in Riyadh, creating a sort of history of itself that feeds on the programs it's developing. Art on the Move is one of the programs we are more advanced in developing. Hopefully in a year's time, we'll be able to see the artworks. It imagines large public artworks at the intersections and roundabouts of the city. It really works to transform your experience of the city and to also create landmarks, so that when you navigate the city, for me, especially when I'm driving around Riyadh, I never really know where I am. And when I find landmarks, they become crucial to moving through the cities. And in this project, international and Saudi artists have been engaged to think site-specific projects. And we've been fascinated how they've been really creative in their thinking, also using digital technology, also using sound art, really pushing the boundaries of what art can be. Welcoming Gateways rethinks the idea of the public gateway of the Grand Arc de Triomphe, if you think of Paris, and how Christo last year has transformed the Arc de Triomphe in an amazing artwork, creating with architects and artists working together 10 grand gateways to the city of Riyadh, with the idea that they are a sign of welcoming to the city of Riyadh and demonstrating how this city wants to be projected to the future in this new vision. Art in Transit is an incredible project. It's imagined to have an immense number of art installations in the new metro that is being finished, and in all the fast bus rapid transit network around the city. The idea is that if you allow citizens in their daily life to encounter art, you turn their daily commute into a cultural experience, into an entertaining experience, and you also help, in a way, creating this new habit of using public transport, because as we know, when cities change and you have a new infrastructure, you have to kind of start using it. Urban Flow integrates public art in the fabric of the city network of pedestrian walkways, pedestrian bridges, and it works both as a way of inviting people to use the city in a different way, and also helping wayfind around the city. Jewels in Riyadh is a project where it thinks of 20 permanent artworks produced by the leading international and Saudi artists to be installed around the city, creating really the base for this public art history of the city of Riyadh. And Riyadh Icon is a program which thinks in grand terms and also in a transversal way what the icon of Riyadh and of the 21st century could be, trying to create this icon for the city. And Garden City, finally, will be a large sculpture park, which creates a new environment to explore contemporary art outside the museum. And in this idea of Garden City, the collaboration with the Ministry of Culture will be crucial to create this idea of how art can be presented and lived both indoors and outdoors. And these are the festivals. Noor Riyadh is a lights festival, which is really arts oriented, and it was launched in 2021 and 2022. In the fall, there will be the second edition. It completely transforms the city, and it presents exhibitions, light installations, video mapping. It's really a fantastic experience, both for art lovers, families, and visitors. And finally, to Wake Sculpture, sculptures from around the world come together to create permanent public sculptures that then will be presented in the city of Riyadh. Thank you very much. And I just went over my 10 minutes, and now back the word to the auditorium.
Well done, Ilaria. I was curious to see how you're going to get through 27 slides, and that was just incredible. Thank you very much. I'd like to now just take the opportunity to invite Dina and Paul to come up onto the podium, and Ilaria is joining us, as you can see, virtually. We're going to ask and have a discussion and some questions. So please, if you have a question, if you don't mind using the microphone, it really is because those who are watching virtually cannot hear your questions unless you talk through the microphone. We know there's a number of people who listen and have been following virtually and sitting there, obviously very enjoying this presentation tonight. So please join us within conversation. Hello. Okay, so this works. Thank you very much. As we said, we've gone from the cultural perspective of world cities to a national vision to actually the reality of implementation in our city today. The thing that comes through for me in the conversation is the themes and threads that run through everyone's presentation. Enriching people's lives. Art, culture, enriching people's lives. At the basis of everything we do, it's about us as people. But the other question, or the other theme that was very strongly coming through was around sustainability. Most of us think of sustainability as a word which is around recycling and using the products that are going to be left as waste in our world. But when we think about sustainability in an arts ecosystem and in culture, we think about sustainability in the way we do things in terms of a soft infrastructure rather than the hard infrastructure. So I'd like to invite you to talk a bit about sustainability in terms of leadership, in terms of cultural development, and in terms of the soft infrastructure and the lessons that we can learn. Perhaps, Paul, you might like to start.
Oh, that's quite a big question.
Yes.
Well, I think that I suppose that in most cities, what you're trying to do is you have to kind of pull off a trick, yeah, which is you have to get the balance right between the physical platforms that you have for cultural activity and then what we now call the ecosystem. When I first started working on this, we didn't talk about it in these kind of organic terms. But the physical platforms are kind of the easy bit in some ways because you can they're there, you can see them. There are ways of building them. There are particular approaches. It's relatively straightforward. I think the difficult thing is how do you get the balance between that and the sort of the human capital, the talent and the human capital. And from what I've just been hearing from those two presentations, what I really like about the sound of it, and I confess to you that I don't really know that much about arts and culture in Saudi Arabia or in Riyadh, is that in all of everything that people are saying, there's an emphasis on trying to kind of build up and support artists and creatives and to build the ecosystem. And in the end, the best way to support artists is to give them work. The best way to have a thriving creative and cultural ecosystem in your system, in your city, is to make sure that there is work for artists and that they have audiences, because audiences help to pay for work. But as I say, I think that the digital platforms are going to give artists huge new opportunities, and I think cities, city governments, and independent cultural organisations and other people in the mix need to kind of work together on that. But I also truly believe that there's a totally new creative economy emerging, which is the opportunities that artists have to work on these urgent missions that we have in cities. There are social issues we have to deal with, there are environmental issues we have to deal with, and I think there's a new generation. I mean, there's a lot of we already have a lot of interesting artists who work on socially engaged practice. But I think there's a kind of a new generation of kind of, if you like, kind of civil activist artists that are coming through. And I think that's a really important thing for any city to have.
Is it my turn? I think I don't have a tremendous amount to add to what Paul has said, although I would add maybe that there is a small additional layer of sustainability that I think about when I think about sustainability. Yes, there is environmental sustainability and environmental responsibility. There's the sustainability of the artist's career and how we can nurture artists' careers and help to nurture artists' careers. But there's also the sustainability of the project and the ongoing relevance of any particular project to the community in which it exists, and ensuring that projects are sustainable and relevant to their communities is another element that I feel is incredibly important when we're talking about specifically public art. Short, but hopefully relevant.
Ilaria, we have you on the screen. Would you like to add to this?
Yeah, maybe I just want to add that what is incredible of what is happening in Riyadh is that the speed of all this transformation, and obviously we are talking of the art side of it, but the transformations are also in many other sides of, you know, like we were saying, building the subway, the bus line, all the gardens of Green Riyadh, as so much is going on so fast that these occasions of talking together and finding ways that, you know, a fast-growing system can integrate itself are very precious, because everybody's going so fast that sometimes it's really hard to connect. While the speed in which a European city adds, you know, public art, maybe there's 2 new artworks every 3 years, and then there is all the time to talk to all the stakeholders and all the managers of the city. Here, the speed makes it really complex, and, you know, we don't want to slow it down, but we really have to find ways of collaborating. And I think in this way, the digital is also a great resource to integrate what transformations are happening and finding ways of making all this transformation more effective.
Thank you. I think it's a really interesting point that you made, and it was a point that came up last night too about the speed of artwork commissions. Cities would do probably 1 or 2 major artworks a year. The vision here is for a massive amount of work. What happens though for artists is they are thinkers. They spend time immersing their expression and ideas to develop a concept that is going to be something that lasts. The digital is wonderful because it's a space that you enter into when you want to enter in, when you make that choice to enter into it. If we think just online in terms of social media, but even, you know, the digital work we see in public places. But the permanent artworks, the permanent works that are going to be there, that make up the very fabric of your society, the very fabric of your visual realm, these take time. These take time to develop those concepts that are worthy of spending the money to put in. And so one of the difficult questions that we have when we're racing forward with an incredible vision is how to balance that time for artists to do what artists do well and to actually make that sort of commitment and the outcome and outputs that visionary leadership is desiring. Big question, Dina. Can you give us any inspiration about how we can balance these 2 sometimes competing goals?
It's not a trick question. It is a trick question, but it's not a trick question. I think when we think about the urban landscape and what is going to enrich the urban landscape, we immediately think about public art. But the reality is there is a massive menu of different kinds of engagement that together enrich an urban landscape. Not all of it is public art. Some of it is. But some of it is, as you know, thinking about where are parks placed and how do we engage communities through the providing of green spaces. How do we think about community centers and how we create opportunities for groups of people in different neighborhoods to come together. Some of it is industrial design and thinking about park benches and so on and so forth. All of these different things together form what ultimately will be, hopefully, a very successful urban landscape. And public art is one of those things. And when we balance these things in the right way, and we think about the engagement with heritage and culture and, you know, urban design and master planning and landscaping and all of these different things that go into, the great thinkers of this world minds, together we come up with something that allows for the artists to have the space and the ability to be the thinkers and the dreamers and the people who come up with the ideas and the ways to articulate, you know, the language that we want to see in visual form.
Ilaria, I'll give you an opportunity now.
I'm not sure I have a lot to add. I mean, one interesting other point of this is obviously I'm the outsider, so I have my point of view is very different from Dina's in a way. And when I started going to artist studios, they were very worried at the beginning of the speed of this transformation. They felt in a way the machine was going too fast for the size of the Saudi art market. And so it was really an interesting conversation where, you know, I come from a country where it's kind of the whole art history went and is gone and there's nothing left. So artists are fighting desperately to try and do something. And hearing artists who are worried because too much is happening too fast is interesting, because you even realize that artists, like you were saying, really like to think through their creative process. And they're afraid they're not kind of figuring out exactly what's happened, and they're being pulled in this super fast machine when they want to be relevant. They want to be sure that what they're producing makes sense for the context. And I think this is a really interesting aspect of how you really work on the production of something which is relevant. And it's also true that it's relevant to who is one of the big questions that comes out, because obviously, yes, sometimes you manage to create public art which is relevant in the same way for everyone, locals, children, families, art lovers. But it's also true that different works talk to different people, and finding this balance in creating this new museum without walls in the city is the difficult mission.
Yeah, so I think, as an outsider, the idea that you have a kind of the political will and the money to do 1,000 artworks is just staggering and astonishing in its own right. The idea that, what's the timescale?
Ilaria, what's the time?
5 years.
Right. And there's a little bit of me that kind of goes gestation, all that kind of stuff. But there's another part of me that goes, hey, go for it. You know, come on. You know, it's part of a plan. The political will is linked to a much, much bigger, richer idea about social and nation building and all that kind of stuff, which is a noble and worthwhile thing. And I think, just to sort of pick up on your point, I think that, you know, in my experience, and I don't work as closely with individual artists on individual projects as, say, UAP do or you two do, but my experience is that it's always the mix. It's always how the artist fits into the mix, and that kind of collaborative activity that really, in the end, makes a difference, and I think is sustainable. And I think that the role that the sort of curators and the producers and the impresarios play in this process is a crucial role, as it always has been when you look at artistic production and the way you make, you get artists to connect with audiences, the way you get them to connect with social issues. There's always in the mix some kind of producer stroke impresario, some sort of curator, somebody who kind of knows the landscape, knows how to talk the different languages. That's not necessarily the role of the artist. So if you look at most of the cities I work in, you'll find a very particular kind of, let's call them a leader, for want of a better word. And, you know, in the olden days, you'd probably call them I like the word impresario. You know, somebody who sees the opportunity, knows how different things work, can speak the language of business, can speak the language of civil society, can speak the language of government. And it's these people, intermediaries, agents, who work between these things that make things work. And I get the impression just from talking to people in Riyadh over the last few days is that, you know, that's very much part of the formula here, is you have a lot of that kind of intermediary activity. But I think without that to connect it to these other concerns, it's never going to be as sustainable or sort of fit or sort of last. If I can just give you one example from one experience that I do have, is that I'm on the board of an organisation called Arts Enterprises for Social Purpose, ASOP. And we're all about trying to kind of train a new generation of artists, essentially to work in health, to work in crime prevention, to work in urban contexts. And the most successful program that's ever been done is a program in the world of health. We've just received a huge amount of money for it, which is all about essentially helping old people to keep their sort of nimbleness so they don't fall over. And the reason why we managed to raise quite a lot of money for it was because we found this amazing piece of research was how much it cost the health system in terms of hospital beds as a result of falls. So we've developed this program. Now the reason why the program works, and it's with dance companies and choreographers, the reason why the program works isn't because choreographers and the dance companies just on their own magically somehow train or kind of work with these old people to give them the kind of additional physical capabilities. It's because they work very closely with physiotherapists. It's literally a half and half. They meet in the middle and they figure out a new form of practice from their individual practices. And I think that's kind of what happens in a lot of urban contexts with artists. Is it's all about, you need the imaginative capability, you need that fresh, different stuff, but it's how you kind of weave that in with other forms of expertise and other kind of attitudes.
So public art for many artists is a new form of practice. Artists who are used to working in their studios and working within galleries and within confined spaces are now being let loose on your city. Public art is not done in isolation. It is done with a huge myriad of people who come together to work on these projects. And it's one of the exciting things for artists is to have this support in these different ways. Because artists, usually their support is very much from galleries and from agents and from curators who will help them do an exhibition around a certain theme of work that was within the bland white walls of an infrastructure building, that the public will make a decision to go or see or not see. Now the artists are coming out into the public realm, and they do work with people like curators, particularly public art curators, who are now acting as those translators, mediators, and sometimes counsellors to actually help the eco-structure or the environment of working in public art. We have our clients, we have our public, we have our place, and we have art. When we bring all those together, we are then actually transforming the way we live. One of the things I find really exciting about artists, though, is that they want to connect with people. Artists don't make their work not to be seen. And here you have this incredible opportunity to give artists this opportunity. We talked about the word last night, opportunity, to actually be seen and to connect to people. Where you invest money, where you invest the most incredible art program that I know of that's happening in the world at the moment, is that you are going to bring artists to your country, whether physically or digitally, in a way that no other country has been able to do in civilization. This is a very exciting time to be here. I'd like to ask if there's any questions from our audience tonight, if they would like to join this conversation.
Thank you very much for your presentations. I'd like to touch on some points regarding the creation of these, you said curating cities, or let's say creating cultural hubs within a city. And I noticed that the focus has been on listed UNESCO World Heritage Sites in terms of creating cultural hubs in Saudi Arabia, like at Diriyah, and we are here, and Al-Ula, and Jeddah. And I'm just wondering that these places already are of universal value and have their richness and their beauty. So should we focus on bringing the arts to them, or should we focus on bringing the arts to impoverished areas that have nothing?
Well, my answer to that is you should do both.
Exactly.
I actually went to, I was in Shirkiyah, apologies for my pronunciation.
Eastern Province.
Yeah, I'm doing some work there, and I went to Al-Hassa, and that's an amazing place, but it needs to be managed as a destination. I mean, you know this, people, your tourism and culture people nationally and regionally know this, because you've got scattering of these amazing physical assets, but there isn't really a way to navigate your way to them and a logic about it. So it's a complete no-brainer. It's a complete no-brainer to build a sort of an ecosystem around that huge asset. But I think equally important is to build smaller clusters, smaller activities. Now, I'm not saying that clustering and area-based activity is the answer to everything, but I think generally speaking in the world of kind of urban development, the feeling is that that's not a bad place to start from when you think about how you inject new life and new activity in an area. To take a very particular area and to think of it as a whole and to sort of manage the investment and the activity in a sort of coherent way. And I think it can happen at all kinds of different levels. I'll give you an example from my own experience, which is sort of experimental level on a neighbourhood basis in London. In London, they're piloting these things called creative health zones. And that's looking at how they can connect the activities of artistic and health organisations, even very small ones, and make them more accessible together to the local population. And the idea is that you would therefore improve health outcomes at a very, very local level. It's a very experimental idea, but again, the basic idea is you take a particular geographical space and you try and I think that the logic of it is that it's more efficient in terms of investment for what you get back, because what you're doing is you're getting value from the connectivity you have in the local area. I think there's quite a lot, I mean, this is kind of urban planning theory, but I think there's quite a lot of economic evidence about this as well.
I might add to that and say, as a nation, we're incredibly blessed to have a beautiful variety of landscapes and an incredible history that goes back centuries. When we think about how we engage in as a commission anyhow, and as a Ministry of Culture, when we think about how we engage, we aren't looking at one region or two regions. 13 regions make up the country. 13 regions with many cities, many villages, and many pockets of population, and many pockets of no population. And they all are worth focusing on in some way, shape, or form. They all have stories to tell, and we want to capture those stories and really highlight them in whatever way is appropriate, whether it's through public art or capturing great culinary history of a region, or the songs and stories and poetry, or whatever it is. And we're here to talk about public art today, but it's not limited to that, because the culture of all of these different environments, again, come together to form a web of what is our culture. And we want to elevate that, and we want to celebrate that. So going back to your point, are we only looking at the places, only a few places? No, we're not. We are looking at the entire country and making sure that we do acknowledge the entire country and what it offers to us.
And then just one quick question to the lady from RCRC, that in her presentation, it was a lovely presentation, but to me, it could be any city in the world you're talking about. It could be Las Vegas, LA, Shanghai. I didn't see any elements of the identity of Riyadh in the presentation at all. So I'd like a little emphasis on that as well. Thank you.
Well, I think you haven't seen them, because obviously in the course of finalizing the project, all information is still private. So we were showing images taken from the Noor Festival, which is actually happening. But when the projects will come to live, they'll be very much site-specific, thought for in every specific roundabout of the city. The gateways will have, artists have really thought for these projects, even of the area and the habits of living. And there is an effort to really try and bring things down to earth. It's unfortunate we can't really disclose things. The issue is until the finalized, contracts and way forward, everything is still very private, but hopefully soon enough we'll be able to share images of the renderings of the real projects for the city of Riyadh.
I'd like to add to that because it's very much around that infrastructure of master planning and that infrastructure of systems with the approach that Paul was talking about, with that approach of empathy. When you're developing a big master plan that is looking at a whole city, you're trying to find a structure that has some sort of organising framework that allows us to develop the systems and processes and procedures that will enable money to be spent well and artists to have great opportunities for it to go out there. At this stage of the project for Ilaria, it's very early, and so the imagery and the presentation is still very much based on aspirational, exciting and dynamic works that we have seen and have been experienced around the world and from Noor Festival. But I guess like Ilaria, all we can really say is watch this space. Watch this space. Artists are going to respond to place. Artists cannot do anything but respond to place because they are inspired by people, they're inspired by space, and they're inspired by time. Give them the opportunity, give them the work, bring them here, and watch this space. It's very exciting.
Yeah, and on this, maybe I just want to add that obviously COVID has made it a little bit difficult in the starting phase because it was really difficult to get artists who were not from the region, even artists based in the Middle East, to come to Riyadh to visit the sites. And it's something that actually started happening with the spring. So we are trying to catch up on this delay of global travel, but the effects will soon be visible.
Thank you, Ilaria. Any other questions, please?
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. It was really an amazing presentation. I have also a question to RCRC in regards to the project itself. So when it comes to art and sustainability, is that something that you're covering?
Well, art, I would say all the project is mainly about art. There are some small parts of the project which are more on architecture, but who can draw the line between art and architecture today. And yes, sustainability is one of the issues. It's also one of the elements when we are trying to finalize the best selection. So yes, they're part of it. And something maybe that I didn't really develop on before is community engagement is one of the big parameters which are trying to guide the project, because it is a public art project. In all the projects, there is a big investment and engagement on the community engagement part. And not only once the works are done, but let's say from a preliminary phase when the first kind of selections are made, there will be a work of engaging with both a national community of artists, intellectuals, and also a local community, depending on the different programs.
Okay, very clear. And so you mentioned community engagement. So may I know how involved is the community of Riyadh in the project?
Well, it's hard to, I think, speak of one community of Riyadh. I mean, given the size of the city and the variety of the inhabitants, so it really will depend on the different projects and the different areas. I mean, there will be a level of community which is really more local community engagement. I mean, there's the idea that even the art in the subway, art in transit, there'll be a number of artworks which are born, also engaging local communities, schools, urban art lab, which are these temporary pavilions, which also will be housed near, in proximity or inside universities, will engage the community of university students. I mean, there is an idea of engaging. A lot of the engagement will be with young citizens, because I think this is something very precious of Riyadh, having such a large population of young citizens who are willing to write the future of the city, the country, and hopefully even internationally. And these are the desired communities we'll be engaging with.
Thank you. I have another question for the Visual Art Commission. So yesterday in the seminar, and I don't recall who said that, but maybe you can help me out with it. One of the cities or the countries, when it comes to government policies, that they put a certain budget for actually public art. So is that something that the Visual Art Commission will actually develop?
This is a practice that exists in benchmark cities around the world, where a certain percentage of capital development or big projects is set aside for the engagement with cultural content, public art. Yes, it can range from a very small percentage to around 2% or so, depending on the city. And there usually is a relationship between the size of the project in terms of budget and how that percentage works out. Obviously, this is not a practice that exists at the moment in Saudi Arabia. Will it exist in the future? Let's see. We certainly have a massive amount of engagement and development on the ground, but let's see.
Okay. I hope it comes from you guys, to be honest.
Hello, thank you very much for enriching us today. I just want to know if there is anything by RCRC to support the artists in terms of education, more knowledge about public art, materials, all these things. I mean, you're asking local artists to produce art, but before that, do they know how to produce art? Especially public art. Of course, they know how to produce art, but there's very few artists in Saudi Arabia that I know that can do public art. But many people would know if they are given a chance and being supported by education and more exposure.
This is an issue that's happened in every city in the world when they've started to go from the traditional monumental statue on a plinth to the contemporary expression of art in public places. Until artists are given that opportunity, they haven't had to learn how to do public art. One of the things we've been very excited about doing, being here in the Biennale, is running a 3-day artist masterclass as an intensive for artists who are engaging in public art. We're very grateful to the Biennale to partner with us to be able to do this. It's something that we're very committed to doing. But it's just the beginning. And it is just the beginning, because first you have to have a need. And the need was not here before. Now there is a need. Now that need has to be addressed. It takes time in all cities. When the city I live in introduced a % for public art, there'd been a cultural void within the city for about 25 years through to the leadership that we had. When the % for art came in, suddenly there was an extraordinary amount of money for artists. There weren't an extraordinary amount of artists who had done public art. And so in the early days, definitely the commissions were going to artists who had that infrastructure and in that support. But as it developed and artists from other places came, it's developed its own ecosystem and its own infrastructure. And artists started to learn from other artists. Government programs started to happen within universities. Manuals were developed by, we had an agency called the Public Art Agency. We developed manuals. We had commissioning models. Contracts were one of the biggest issues that we had to look at, because all the contracts previously were always around construction contracts, and artists had never worked in construction in public realm, but a public art becomes essentially a construction project once you start putting public to it. Dina?
Can I just add that also identifying the different roles that need to be a part of a public art project, so that the people that really do have the knowledge of any one particular area are involved. For example, the curator, the engineer, the architect, and all of these people come together to form a team with the artist. And they support each other in this process, as well as, you know, all of these other things that you're mentioning that will come as an ecosystem develops. But it's just identifying those roles at this stage, because they're, you know, as you would expect, when something hasn't been a priority or hasn't been very present, there isn't awareness around it. So we create the awareness. And with that awareness comes evolution of practice and next steps and so on. So I think this is a very important point, and one that we really do need to focus on. We cannot ask our artists to go out and do something that they're not supported to do. So very, very important point.
It's sometimes a bit of a double-edged sword, you know, which comes first, you know, the opportunity or the experience. Often they come together, and those different professions actually develop over time. When we first started doing public art, probably about 25 years ago in Brisbane, there was no such thing as a public art project manager. We didn't use curators because the only curators were actually gallery curators and had no idea about public realm and particularly construction projects. Now the ecology has really developed. We now have very distinct public art curators. They are curating for public places, but they also understand that they're working with clients who may not know anything about art, that they're working with a public who may or may not have any opportunity to have say in what their art's going to be because it's a private project or because it's got a short time frame. And these different types of people start to come into the mix over time. I'm very, very positive and confident about what is happening in this city. I think the very fact that we're sitting here tonight in the Biennale speaks volumes about what can be achieved. Yes, it's the first one, but it's only the first. And I really believe that given the amount of support and infrastructure that has been developed and needing to develop fast, the fact that we have this digital economy now, that we can start to draw on people all over the world, that we can jump onto Zooms and have meetings where we couldn't have before, you are going to have the opportunity to have that information much faster than we did years ago. Your level of growth is going to be absolutely exponential.
And then if I can add, as a curator, I always like the artist to surprise me, not me to teach the artist how to make a public artwork, because it's true that sometimes artists really think out of the box and completely surprise you. Then maybe you can support them in, you know, turning a vision, a dream into something real. That's where you need the infrastructure and the knowledge of turning it real. But I don't think you need to have done public art before to have a vision or an idea which is stunning for how you use public space.
Hello, thank you for your discussion today. It's very insightful. I'm a behavioral epidemiology researcher, and as part of the research we're doing on the global burden of mental illness around the world, we're studying neighborhood characteristics and how they influence the degree and the burden of mental illness in each neighborhood. We've already mapped out what's going on in Saudi Arabia. And there's a growing field of cities and mental health and the effect of cities and urbanicity on mental illness. And I just wanted to comment that as you are developing your plans and collaborating on your projects with the urban designers, that you always remember that public art can help prevent and bring awareness to mental illness, which is a global, huge problem, very silent problem that I think art can help a lot with alleviating.
How wonderful to have you in the room tonight. Thank you for this comment. I chair an organisation called Artisan, which looks at art, craft and design and how we blur those boundaries. And one of the things that we've been doing in our study is how craft in particular is so much more accessible to the everyday person. A lot of people don't think themselves as artists, but they're happy to knit or paint or, you know, fix a car, do some woodwork. These hand skills, this opportunity to make also builds up this sort of collective experience where they share their knowledge with other people and come together. Once we start bringing art into the mix of that and we have something visual that we can actually respond to and be inspired, I do believe there is a very strong place for art and craft in our health and well-being. It does bring us out of our isolation, but it also gives us purpose in our isolation. It gives us something to do while we're quietly on our own, and we get into that flow. And we all know that when you get into that flow of making, the endorphins, the serotonin, it all starts to peak, and it does make you feel better. Then next is, how do we connect with that socially, and public art is part of that social impact.
I just might add that I think one of the things that is really important about art, full stop, whether public or not public, is the fact that it does not exclude any one segment of society. It is meant to be shared. It is meant to be inclusive, and it is meant to engage. It doesn't matter if you're young or elderly or female or male or you know, at the top of your game or maybe challenged by something, whatever it might be. Art is to include everyone, and you know, we can't lose sight of that. It's really, really important. So you know, again, I echo what you said, and I think it is really important to draw attention to this. It does speak to the nature of the subject, and we, you know, we don't want to forget that ever. So thank you.
Ilaria, you were talking before about the Riyadh Art Program with the urban labs. And I think this is such an exciting opportunity to bring art into a visual place. We know with the climate here, it's often much more comfortable to be within a pavilion and to be within an internal environment. But these urban labs are going to have that opportunity in different places within the community, and I think even have the opportunity to move, Ilaria, where the community can come together and experience that making. This, to me, is a really visionary way of bringing art to the community, because you have a beautifully designed pavilion which gives you the visual impact and that association with creativity, but then what happens inside it is actually the opportunity to invite people to come together. Ilaria, would you like to talk a bit more about that program?
Yeah, I mean, the idea is that thinking of the whole of Riyadh, and we really felt that the idea of digital art and, you know, art made with digital means was in a way hard to, even if it's not really true, because like I was saying with Art on the Move, which is art at the roundabouts, we've already had proposals which are in a way developed through digital art and are very futuristic, but we really wanted to give a chance of a focus of encountering art in more intimate terms. And so these pavilions, and we're really working on finalizing the project, should see the coming together of either architects or designers who think of the container and of the content, which is art. And these two spaces together become environments where people meet around the art. And then obviously the idea is that inside these pavilions, they are perfect environments also to create community engagement, to create workshops, to engage with the art, that specific artworks in the pavilions, but in a way also with the whole of Riyadh Art project in general, because it is an occasion to offer information, to offer accessibility to the whole project.
Thank you, Ilaria. Any more questions? I think I might wrap up and say thank you very much for coming. It's been a really exciting foray into this exploration of culture, vision, and creativity. It's exciting to be here in the Biennale, as I've said before. Dina, thank you very much for coming tonight and for sharing your vision with us and the huge work that you're doing as one of the 11 commissions. Ilaria, so lovely to meet you. I hope we get to meet you in person again.
Absolutely, thank you.
Thank you very much, all the best. And Paul from BOP, I've been saying BOP, I like to do the acronyms, from London. Thank you very much for laying the foundation around the culture and the leadership environment that actually takes us from the digital age into that age of empathy, which I think we're all very keen to be part of. And thank you all very much tonight for coming. It's been such a pleasure to have you here. We hope to see you again tomorrow night, which is our last talk, which will be on looking at next generation technologies. This is very much looking at how artists use technologies to extend their practice, not necessarily about being a digital artist or being a media artist, but how things like artificial intelligence and robotics and advanced manufacturing actually change the way industry and manufacturing engage with creative ideas. So we hope to see you here tomorrow night. Thank you very much.